welcome to another live stream on this Friday podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Dennis MacDonald. And today we'll be talking a bit about the parallels between Luke Acts and the Homeric epics. And it's good to have you back on the show, Dennis.
Well, it's a pleasure as always, Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me once again. What would you say are some of the best parallels that you can think of real quick between Luke and Acts and the Homeric epics?
Jacob, I think it's important to set it in the context of Luke's relationship to Virgil's Aeneid. And the reason that that's important is that Luke Acts imitates many of the same Homeric passages that Virgil imitated in the Aeneid in order to write his founding myth. And Luke Acts is not a history. At least it's not a history as we usually think of it. It's a founding myth. And Luke makes that pretty clear right from the beginning. And I want to talk just a little bit about the similarities between Luke Acts and Virgil, and the Virgil's Aeneid, especially when to give a background to the Homeric imitations. The Aeneid is a story about Trojan refugees under the leadership of Aeneas, who have to leave their city because it's been destroyed and occupied by Greeks. And they're looking for another homeland. And Aeneas, who's the son of Venus, is under the protection of the Olympians to a large extent. And so when he and his flotilla of surviving Trojans set out for a new homeland, they sailed the Mediterranean, and a shipwreck soon puts them on the shores of northern Africa and the city of Carthage, where Queen Dido is reigning. After a liaison with Dido, he is instructed by the Olympians that he needs to leave for another homeland. And there are several times when Aeneas is directed toward Italy. He arrives in Italy in Book 6 after a number of adventures that are, in many cases, imitations of the Odyssey. So, for example, Virgil has his own version of the story of Polyphemus. But the last 6 books of the Aeneid imitate the Iliad. And these are wars between the immigrant Trojans and the resident Italians. It ends with the death of Turnus, who's the champion of the Italians. And the reader knows that it's inevitable now that the Trojans will merge with the local Italians, lose their identity as Trojans, but establish then a new kingdom, which is a hybrid of these groups. And ultimately, their capital will be in Rome. The Acts of the Apostles is the story about the migration of Luke Acts is a story of the migration of the Kingdom of God movement from Jerusalem through Europe. Paul goes back to Jerusalem and there is arrested because of Jewish opposition, and ultimately is taken to Rome, where he then is proclaiming the kingdom of God unhindered. That's the last sentence of the Acts of the Apostles. So we have a movement of a group from the East with several venerated heroes that have a shipwreck and other adventures and end up in Rome with the establishment of a new kingdom that's made up of sociological hybrids, a hybrid that is social identities merge Judaism and Gentiles. So those similarities have been recognized by many scholars, quite rightly, and they still deserve more explanation. But that's the background to it. So Luke is aware of the Aeneid, but he's not imitating it directly. Instead, and quite brilliantly, he's imitating the same Homeric stories that Virgil did. So let me give you one example that appears right at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, that, as far as I can tell, nobody else has seen, and very few scholars today are willing to acknowledge. The story that he uses for his infancy narrative is in part from Matthew. So he knows Matthew. He has a number of points of comparison that are curious between himself, his account, and Matthew. But he's using clearly the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite that was important for the dynasty of Aeneas to Augustus, called the Julio-Claudian line, and was known by Virgil and cited by Virgil in several ways. Before I get to that, let me just say one more piece. Matthew traces Jesus's genealogy to Abraham, who's the father of faith and the patriarch of the Jewish movement. Luke, on the other hand, has a similar but not identical genealogy, but he traces it beyond Abraham to God, to Adam and God. Now, in the Iliad, already there is a genealogy for Aeneas that traces his genealogy on his mother's side to Aphrodite, who for Virgil will be Venus. But on his father's side, through Dadanus, he goes all the way back to Zeus. So almost at the beginning of his gospel, Luke is announcing that Jesus too has a patrimony, a genealogy that goes back to the highest of the gods. In this case, the Jewish god, to rival the god of the Greeks, Zeus. So let's go to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. This is a wonderful poem. And it's a veneration of Aeneas, basically. Zeus coaxes his daughter, Aphrodite, the love goddess, to fall in love herself with Anchises, a beautiful Trojan. Anchises is out alone taking care of his livestock, and Aphrodite shows up disguised as a mortal woman, but gloriously beautiful. And the two of them are alone in the forests or in the pasture. And he takes a look and it says, you so beautiful, you must be a goddess. And she says, oh, no, I'm not a goddess. I'm just a mortal like you, big boy. And of course, they make love with no one else noticing. And later, Aphrodite says, I am a goddess. And Anchises is petrified. He knows he's just made love with a goddess, and he better make amends in some way. And she says, no, I will birth you a son, and you will name him Aeneas, because I've had this this grief in making love with a mortal. Now, and he will have an empire that will not end. That is, he will found a dynasty. Now, if you reveal to anyone that you made love with me, Zeus is going to punish you. So you can't tell anybody that we've made love. And that's the end of the story. Luke imitates that story 3 times. The first time is for the birth of John the Baptist, where the angel Gabriel appears to Zechariah, who's alone in the temple offering sacrifices. And Zechariah is panicking. Well, he's never seen an angel, not at the before. And the angel says, no, don't be afraid. You're receiving a blessing from God. Your wife, Elizabeth, is going to bear a son, and you're going to call his name John. And he's going to be helping his people. Now, Zechariah can't believe this because he and his wife are aged. And because he's not believing, he gets punished by the angel with deafness. With being mute. So he can't tell anybody what he heard from the angel. The next story is the angel appears to Mary, and Mary's alone in her room. And Mary is terrified, as Zechariah had been, that she's encountering an angel. And the angel says, "Do not fear, Mary, you found favor with God. And the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and you will birth a son, and you will name him Jesus, and he will have a kingdom that never ends." And then the angel leaves. In the third example, the angel appears to shepherds outside in the pasture with their flocks. You have that same motif in the Homeric hymn with Anchises. And the angel says, "I'm giving an announcement to you that the baby is going to be born, and he will be a savior." And all of a sudden, the angel is surrounded by an army of angels. And then they're declaring peace on earth to those of goodwill. Now, tell me those are not parallels. Tell me that Luke is not trying to set up his reader to see that he's going to write an alternative founding myth. So that's just one of the examples. There are other examples of these imitations between that where Luke is rivaling Virgil, and in fact they're peppered throughout Luke Acts, but especially in the Acts of the Apostles. So there you have both Virgil and Luke are imitating, for example, the shipwreck of Odysseus in Odyssey 5. The parallels have been seen for many often, but it's clear that Virgil is imitating Homer, but it's also clear that Luke is doing so too, and he's doing so as part of this the voyages of these groups to Italy. Come on, that's not by accident. I said before that Virgil and Luke both have, Homer and Virgil both have their versions of the story of Polyphemus. That's the background for Mark's story of the Gerasene demoniac, which Luke accepts. You have a beautiful example of Mark's imitation of the death of Hector that had informed Virgil's story of the death of Turnus at the end of the Aeneid. And Luke knows what Mark has done. He prefers to make Jesus' death like the death of Socrates, but he himself has these imitations of the death of Hector in the anticipation of the crucifixion. And I don't know how many more parallels you want me to give. Now, in many cases, Luke is imitating Homer without parallels in the Aeneid. So the parallels with Homer in the Aeneid do not govern the ones that he's going to use, but the density of common parallels is really quite striking. Let me give you one more, which my student, Michael Kochenash, first discovered, and that the two of us have developed in somewhat different ways. Of course, the hero of the Aeneid is Aeneas. There's a character in the Acts of the Apostles who's called Aeneas. And it's the Latin spelling of Aeneas, not the Greek one that would be typical, not the one that Homer uses. And the story in Acts is about a man who has been crippled, and Peter heals him. There's a story in the Iliad where Aeneas has his hip crushed by a boulder thrown by an enemy, and his mother, Aphrodite, heals him. There are stories of the Aeneas, of course, in the Aeneid, and in the last book, not far before the death of Turnus, Aeneas takes an arrow, and his mother, Venus, cures him. So in the Iliad and in the Aeneid and in the Acts of the Apostles, you have an Aeneas, Roman spelling, not Latin, but the Latinized version of the Greek, who has been paralyzed and is cured. That's not by accident. But here's the real zinger. The next story is about a woman named Tabitha in Acts. Tabitha means deer, and Luke makes that clear by translating it into Greek, which is Dorcas, that is a deer. The story of Aeneas and Dido is a love story that turns bad for Dido, and she commits suicide after Aeneas leaves. But there's a famous simile in Book 4 of the Aeneid where the poet says she was so infatuated with Aeneas that she was like, simile, she was like a deer who'd been struck with an arrow and is running in pain throughout the forest, looking for a satisfaction and healing. So you have Dorcas, the deer, like Dido, the deer. But Dorcas is also similar to Penelope. So here's the story Luke says. Luke goes to Joppa, and he goes and sees weeping women who are mourning the death of Dorcas. And she was a great weaver, and the women took pride in showing the weaving that she had done. And also she was very welcoming to people who came to Joppa, and she was full of good deeds. But she died, and she was taken to an upper room, Baron, and there they were putting her in state before burying her. Peter arrives. He goes up to the upper room, and he cures her. Now, Penelope, of course, was a very generous woman, and her generosity was renowned far and wide. She also was a famous weaver. She kept weaving the Shroud of Laertes, but unraveling it at night so that she wouldn't have to marry one of the suitors. And they lamented about it, caught her at the act, and insisted that she finish. Dido was Virgil's Penelope. She was a weaver. She wove a beautiful robe that included gold for Aeneas. She's the one who was like a deer, who was wounded. She was generous. She invited the Trojans to settle in her Carthage. What could be more welcoming than that? And she did fall in love and wanted to marry Aeneas, and that didn't work out. But in the end, she commits suicide. But not Dorcas in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter heals her. And instead of the mourning of women in Carthage for the death of Dorcas, we have the rejoicing of women in Joppa for the rescue of Dorcas from death. Now, here's another piece that's fascinating. This happens at Joppa. Joppa, of course, is the scene where the port where Jonah tried to depart from the demand that he was to go to preach to Gentiles in Nineveh. The story of Dorcas is the last story that we have about the Peter and a mission to Israel. The Gentile mission begins in the very next verse. That cannot be by accident. Now, I could give you other examples, but I think those are some of the best. And here you have the name Aeneas. You have the issue about Gentile inclusion. Well, one finds a Dorcas-like character who, a Dorcas who's somewhat like a Dido, dying but rising. I mean, I can give you other examples. I'm going to let you ask questions if you wish. But readers sensitive to Greek and Roman poetry surely would have seen that this is an alternative mythology. It is not historical reporting. One of the great mistakes that scholars still make is to call Luke Acts the earliest history. Even if you say that it's a fictional history, that doesn't quite get it. The point is that it's not intended to be history. It's intended to be a founding myth that shapes the social memory of his readers to say how proud they should be of John the Baptist, of Jesus, of Peter, and especially of Paul at the end of the Acts of the Apostles as being champions of a different kind of kingdom, one that has a different kind of a dynasty, and one that will have lasting power, unlike the Julio-Claudian line. So that's been a lot to say in just a few moments, but so I'll let you ask some questions, and I can give you more examples if it would be useful.
When you look at the way Acts talks about Paul in general, is anything in Acts, in your view, reliable about the historical Paul? Does it tell us anything reliable about Paul? Or is it so, or is Paul so retrofitted based on Luke's use of the Homeric material as he reimagines Paul that it is almost impossible to tell when it's reliable and when it's not?
No, it's not impossible to know. And the reason is that we can be pretty sure, in fact, I'm positive, that Luke had a collection of Paul's letters. There is evidence of at least 5 of them in the Acts of the Apostles. And they have to do with Paul's journeys, with people in his retinue, in some of the controversies he had, and so on. And I think even though the Acts of the Apostles is derivative, Luke would have had no contact whatsoever with Paul, despite the title of Luke that he was Jesus's physician. Luke didn't know Paul, but Luke knows something about Paul, and therefore one needs to test the images of Paul in Acts against the material that he would have seen in Paul's own writings. And I think in many cases, those correlations are really quite striking and worthy of consideration. Let me give you one example. Luke's version of the council at Jerusalem is much longer, and it has an imitation in the Aeneid, in my view, quite clearly. It goes on for a chapter and a half, and these are meaty chapters loaded with information. At the beginning of Galatians 2, Paul goes into a rather detailed account of what happened for him when he was in Jerusalem and trying to get permission from the pillars of the church to allow for a Gentile mission. Luke surely saw that and saw it as an opportunity to expand by appealing to a different council, this one in the Iliad, that was convened in order to get Achilles to come back into warfare. So the simple answer to your question is complex, unfortunately. Yes, there is historical information embedded in the Acts of the Apostles. Not because Luke had independent knowledge of these events, but because he had intimate familiarity with Paul's own letters. And therefore, there are at many points confluences between the epistles and the Acts of the Apostles. So one should not dismiss the information in Acts altogether, but rather sift it for Luke's own literary contributions and those that can be attributed to the Pauline tradition by means of these letters.
We have a super chat question from Adia Morgenstern. Thank you for your super chat. Bilby's reconstruction of QN indicates an Aesopian fable similar to the frog and the fox.
Mark Bilby is a friend of mine. And no, I don't believe it for a moment. We also have a different reconstruction of Q. My issue is, in part, where else do we find how many people knew? Many people knew of Aesop. How many would have known the fable of the frog and the fox? And how many similarities does one find that can't be attributed to regular fable traditions and composition? So Mark's a very smart and creative scholar, and I think he merits more attention than he gets. But I would find trouble in understanding what's going on between Q and Aesop. By the way, my Q is very different, and the criteria that are used are really quite different. And I see nothing to be Aesopian, as you have it, in Q. But that's Adia, that's a very smart comment and question. I thank you for it.
When it comes to the we passages and Acts, what is your view on the hypothetical we document that supposedly is earlier than Acts that was stitched together by the final editor that created the canonical Acts that we have today? Do you think there's any merit to that, or is it just, or is the we passages, the so-called we passages, part of Acts' use of Homer?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think it has a very simple answer. Please, there never was a we source. This is source criticism that is really run amok. And what we need is not source criticism, but model criticism. We need to find analogies in Greek literature that would have been available to Luke to help us understand why and how he is crafting the narrative. Now, why is it that the we narratives are almost always about voyages? It's because we have we voyages in the Odyssey. Nestor has a we voyage. Menelaus has a we voyage. Odysseus has a we voyage. And then he lies several times and has other we voyages at the end. The purpose of a we voyage for Luke probably is to give the impression that he was a participant but that means that the accounts that he has are trustworthy. By the way, Virgil has Aeneas give a we voyage. The voyage, the shipwreck at the beginning of the Aeneid in book 1 in book 2, Virgil is talking to Dido, and he describes the war and his shipwreck in the first person plural. And it says, and we started out from Troy, and we made our way into the Mediterranean. Luke begins his we voyages by saying that they left Troas, which is ancient Troy for ancient Romans. We know that they identified Troas and Troy as the same. And then they go on this voyage. Now, people who know Homer and know Virgil would know that, okay, this is great. Now we have a wee voyage of this Christian evangelist, and he's going to play a role that is similar to what we can find in epic. So no, there's no wee voyage, for pity's sakes. This is a part of a beautiful and recognized strategy of literary composition.
What do you think gave Luke the idea of not? I know that as you were just saying a moment ago, that the we passages are obviously there as part of Luke's attempt to make it look like he was a traveling companion of Paul. But how was Luke planning to make it coherently fit with the narrative he was creating outside of the we passages in his use of Homer?
When Luke talks about his sources in his first volume, his gospel, he says that many have undertaken to write about the events, to write an exposition of narratives that happened among us. The Q document ends with the death of Jesus. Mark's story ends with the resurrection of Jesus and his Great Commission. John is going to end at a similar point, although Luke did not know John. John was written later. Luke wanted to extend his narrative as part of his competition with Virgil's Aeneid in order to embrace the Apostle Paul as well. The problem there is that he no longer has Q or Mark or Matthew to help him out. He does have Papias's exposition, and Papias mentions the daughters of Philip, mentions a Judas Barsabbas, who's probably the Barsabbas Justus that we have in the Acts of the Apostles. He mentions the deaths of James and John, or Jacob and John. and almost certainly had narratives that extended beyond the time of Jesus's death and resurrection. So, what is Luke going to do to justify the reliability of his founding myth? He's going to insert himself into the narrative in order to make him one of the sources of information of what he's doing. Now, that may sound like it's an attempt to write a history, but it doesn't need to be. It can be also that he's trying to play a literary game that the reader can understand, that he is identifying with the Apostle Paul, identifying himself as one of those followers, and that leads some credence to the narrative that he's giving. So if it's history at all, it's kind of a playful pseudo-history, in my view.
What do you think led the author of Acts to decide that he needs to mythologize historical Paul? He needs the historical Paul to do miracles too. He needs the historical Paul to imitate Greco-Roman heroes. What made the author of Acts decide that that was necessary?
Again, I'm going to go back to the importance of the Aeneid as giving a definition of the Roman Empire. And the Julio-Claudian line and the optimism of the Augustan period had vanished. And we can see this in Latin literature itself. There are other histories that are being written, other poems, other epics that are being written that attempt to talk about what are the fortunes of the Roman Empire now that that the promise of Virgil in the Aeneid has vanished. And I think Luke is engaged in that project. Luke is one of the members of the Second Sophistic, of intellectuals at the time who were writing, glorifying mostly the time of Homer and the ancient Greeks over against the problems that were afflicting the Roman Empire in the early second century and even before. So I think his project was motivated by trying to give an extended founding myth that included the Pauline mission, successfully preaching in Rome, so that his communities would have an understanding of the growth of the movement. Now, of course, there are lots of sub-themes going on in Luke Acts. Concern for the poor, for example, or compliance with Roman law, or the ability of the Christian movement to defend itself against accusations. By the way, I'm going to suggest something else that I am pretty sure of, and I don't think anybody else has approached this. Stephen Mason, a remarkably astute scholar of Josephus, has shown, I think, compellingly, that Luke had seen statements about John the Baptist and Jesus in the Antiquities of Josephus, including the contested Testimonium Flavianum, which is a Christian insertion into the Antiquities about Jesus. But clearly there was something there about Jesus that Christians thought was offensive, because immediately after the Testimonium Flavianum, Josephus says, and let me tell you about another outrage. So Josephus would have thought that whatever he wrote about Jesus was an outrage, and that would have been an outrage for Christians. And so they rewrote it. Some people said it was Hegesippus. Other people say Eusebius of Caesarea. I don't know, but I can tell you that the Christian version was not what Josephus said, but there was something that Josephus said that was outrageous. Now, if we take a look at two other passages, one is about John the Baptist, and another is about Jesus's brother, James or Jacob, and those who were with him, we have a sense of what the complaint was. The complaint was, apparently, that like John, Jesus was stirring up problems inside the Jewish community about two issues. One was about fidelity to Mosaic law. Did all Jews need to observe every commandment? Or can one be a part of the Jewish community without obeying everything? That is a much more relaxed understanding of nomos or law enforcement. The other is, and Josephus is very good about this, the temple was mismanaged for over a century before this. And the people who were, the Jews who were working for and managing the temple were often corrupt, motivated by greed, and interested in money and the temple tax and so on. And there was a lot of resentment by people about the temple tax and about the wealth of the Jerusalem temple. So Jesus was causing trouble inside of Judaism. He was popular, and the leading men, according to Josephus, the leading men of Jerusalem convinced Pilate that he ought to be killed. And that was the crucifixion. And Josephus probably felt that that was a legitimate thing to do, to bring some peace to these squabbling Jewish groups. And Josephus has his own issues with various Jewish groups that led up to divisions in the Jewish war. So when Luke writes, he goes out of his way, especially in the gospel, to say that Pilate 3 times declared Jesus to be dikaios. He's righteous. He's innocent. The centurion who kills him says, surely this man was dikaios. The same word is used over and over again by Plato and Xenophon to say that Socrates was killed even though he was dikaios. At one point, Xenophon says it was so outrageous that Socrates was killed because he was the most righteous of anybody. So I think Luke may have seen this passage about Jesus in Josephus. He apparently saw it, the business about John the Baptist and other things that were going on, and wanted to say that Jesus was dikaios. He was just. Notice also that the charges against Jesus are similar to the ones against Socrates. He's disturbing the people, and he's saying that there's a king or a potentate of some kind that is foreign. The same thing happens then with these apologies at the end of the Acts of the Apostles. Paul says, and Paul never would have said this, by the way, everything in the law and the prophets I believe. So I'm dikaios. You should not punish me. Furthermore, I was in the temple not trying to cause a riot. I wasn't there with a crowd. I was trying to worship. And these other people grabbed me And so I'm dikaios. So much of Luke and Acts is to prove that Paul and Jesus were not troublemakers. They were Torah observant. They were respectful to the temple. Now, I am quite enamored of the notion that that is in order to correct Josephus. Josephus said that Jesus caused an outrage among Jews and had it coming because he was either Pilate's killing of Jesus or Jesus himself, whatever was going on, was an outrage. And I don't know anybody who's tried to make this connection, but the connection between Paul and Jesus, Socrates as being just, and the way that Luke is construing them in the Acts of the Apostles as over against the possible charges against Jesus in the Testimonium Flavianum is certainly worth more investigation.
We have a couple of super chats I'd like to take real quick. Jeff Starrett, thank you for your super chat. Did ancient listeners of Luke recognize comparison?
That is a very important question. The problem is, who do we know recognized Luke or the Acts of the Apostles at all? The Acts of the Apostles was not popular. And when Christian authors retold the story of Christian origins, if they knew the Acts of the Apostles, they ignored it or attempted to refute it. So it's not until we get to the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, the likes of Irenaeus and so on, where Luke is considered important. And it's important there because it's understood to be historical. It's no longer a rival mythology. The earliest author to have seen the parallels between, to have seen the Luke and Acts as a unit, believe it or not, was the earliest author of the Gospel of John, the earliest gospel I call the Dionysian Gospel. And the reason we can say that is that over and over again, I would say 3 or 4 times, but that's repeated, you have imitations of the Gospel or Acts in the Gospel of John. But I don't think the author of Gospel of John knew that where these antecedent passages came from. The best I could guess is that the author of this early Gospel of John saw in the Acts of the Apostles imitations of Virgil's of Euripides' Bacchae, and because Paul already is playing the role of a Dionysus in the Acts of the Apostles, and now Jesus is doing so in that Gospel. Apart from that, I don't know of any early Christian author that was aware that Luke had imitated Homer in the Acts of the Apostles.
Onus, thank you for your super chat. Do you believe there is mimesis with Greco-Roman biographies like Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, Roman imperial propaganda like Pax Romana, martyrdom literature, etc.?
There's no doubt about it. But the nature of those imitations often is really quite different. One can say that mimesis was so embedded in Greek literature and education that it's really hard to find any of these literatures that are entirely innocent of imitating models. Sometimes they're announced, many times they're occulted, but even more so, in many times, they probably are not even recognized by the authors. That is, they've been instructed in Greek poetry. These tropes and themes and so on are embedded in them, and they may not even be conscious of imitation. And Onus, this is a great question, because we don't know in particular cases the level or the kind of technology of mimesis that's involved. In some cases, as we have it in Luke Acts, it's clear that the author is probably consulting a text and is rewriting the text and expects his readers to see the differences, the syncresis, that is the comparisons between the two texts, and to benefit from that comparison. In other cases, we know from Quintilian that in order to have mimesis, the student should read the antecedent text many times so that the tropes that constitute a particular story become ingrained. And the image that has been used is it's like a cow that grazes in the pasture and has to bring it back up in order to chew the cud before it can actually give milk. And in that case, that you have a pre-digested version of the story that then gets regurgitated, sorry for the image, in the text. And so it doesn't necessarily look like the text. It looks like it's been reworked. In other cases, the author may simply remember the story from youth or from having it read by a rhapsode, and liked the story and decided to retell it without advertising that it has that model. There's no syncresis involved. It's simply straight imitation, almost plagiarism, but unintended plagiarism. So this is one of the reasons that mimesis criticism has had difficulty catching on, because not all mimesis is one text over another. Much of it is cultural influence, but it is mimesis nonetheless. Now, of course, there also is the issue of oral tradition and folklore, and we can't ignore that. That happens also in the transmission of these narratives. But the ones that you've identified, at least some of the texts that you've identified, are themselves coming out of the second sophistic. Plutarch would be an example. And surely we can expect him to occasionally have asides or have influence from Greek poetry. I'd be surprised if you can't find it.
And in my final question, when Luke uses Papias in conjunction with his use of Matthew, is Papias, in your view, aware of the Homeric influence going on here when Papias looked at Matthew and Mark? And did Papias's understanding of the scenario influence the way Luke used Homer?
That is a very important question. And I'm going to give you two answers that are moving in the same direction, but a little differently. Papias and his informant John the Elder, probably the author of the pastoral epistles, the Johannine epistles, has no clue about the influence of classical Greek poetry. Not a clue. And if somebody could prove me wrong about that, I'd be delighted. And by the way, Papias seems to have a fairly good level of education. But in this case, he doesn't see in the Gospels anything that would evoke classical Greek poetry. So we really are not there. Luke, in using Papias, and by the way, most of Papias doesn't survive. It was a 5-volume work, and we have 12 pages of it. And most of Papias is concerned about the Gospels. Luke has other sources that he can use that are older and more reliable than worrying about Papias. And that includes Matthew. His use of Papias, though, is quite interesting when you get to things that happen after the gospel stories, including an alternative story of the death of Judas, a possible alternative also to stories about Barsabbas' justice. I wish we had more information about what Papias had to say about the daughters of Philip, because they aren't mentioned anywhere else except in apocryphal literature, apart from the Acts of the Apostles. So the answer to the first part of your question is, as far as I can tell, Papias didn't have a clue about Greek poetry. And I don't think he saw the Gospels at all as founding mythologies. I think he saw them as historical biographies. And he did not have access to Luke. Luke had access to Papias. And Luke doesn't get any benefit from Papias for his founding myth, except these allusions to certain characters that appear also in Papias. But there are not very many of them. You could put them all on 2 pages.
There is actually one more question, because I forgot to ask this earlier. Where did Luke get the prodigal son from? And is there a parallel story to it in Homer?
Oh, that is so great a question. I'm so glad you asked it. The Q document apparently contained this story. A man had 2 sons. And he asked one of his sons to go and help in the field. And he said, "Sure, Dad, I'll go." And he never went. The other one said, "No, Dad, I'm too busy today. I'm not going to do that." But he did go ultimately and help in the field. So which of those 2 did the Father's will? It was the one who at first said no and then went. And this is a kind of metaphor for the Gentile mission. Gentiles originally did not say they would go in the field, and ultimately that they do. So this is a transfer, a kind of a shift already in Q toward shaming Israel to become like Gentiles who, in some cases, are in the field. Luke sees that story in Q. By the way, that's the version in Matthew's, the one I just gave you, but it certainly is earlier than the other one. He thinks that's a great story, just waiting for an imitation. He begins at exactly the same wording. A man had 2 sons. Exactly the same wording. Now, one of them was the younger one was a goof off. He wanted to have his inheritance now. He wanted to go and travel and spend it on women and song and good meals. And before long, he squandered it. And he wasted it on prostitutes. And he was reduced to eating the food of swine. Odysseus left Troy, left the war to go to Troy. He fought there, and on the way back, he spent time in bed with Circe and Calypso. And the story of Circe talks about his soldiers being reduced to eating the food for swine, and they were transformed into swine. Okay, so then the young man says, I want to go back home, and I'm going to appeal to my father so that he receives me as one of his slaves, because that's got to be better than where I am now. So he goes back home, and his father was worried that he died. And when he saw his son coming from a distance, he ran up, kissed, and hugged him and said, let's have a feast. I want to give you a robe, a ring, and a great meal. And I'm so glad to have you home, son. So this is the prodigal. But there's an older son. And the older son says, hey, Dad, you never gave me a fatted calf to have a party with my son. And I've been in the field working all the time. And so in this case, you have, as in the Q parable, a parable of two sons. One is reliable, but does not get rewarded. The other was not reliable and gets rewarded. So I think the prodigal is no one different from Mimesis of Odysseus. And when Odysseus finally returns home to his father, what does his father do? He kisses him. And then they go off to a house, the Laertes orchard building, and they have meat, roasted meat, and he's given a robe. Now, come on. Those parallels are just too sweet. And by the way, I'm not the first person to have seen that. Other people have seen that the prodigal son looks an awful lot like Odysseus himself, coming home to be rescued by received by his father. And notice that his father says, my son who was dead is now alive. Of course, the son was not dead. But Laertes had thought that his son was dead because it took 20 years to get home. And so these parallels are really quite wonderful. So there was not a parable of the prodigal son before Luke got hold of it. And he was rewriting the story in the Lost Gospel and did it magnificently. My partner is a therapist, and she has used this story over and over again for talking about reconciliation of a parent with a stray child. And Luke understood the power of that story. And I think we need to give Luke, and not oral tradition, the credit for this compelling narrative.
I just want to tell everybody real quick, in the description below, I got the link to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to go get 2 shipwrecked Gospels. So go get it. It's right there in the description below. And one more thing, Dennis MacDonald will be debating Bruce Chilton on September 13th at 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. Did Luke use Matthew, and which version of Q is correct? So that's what the debate's about. Don't forget it. Tune in, and I'll see everybody later. Thanks for joining me, Dennis.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.